As the day quietly fades and stars begin to whisper above, welcome to Korean History Whispers. Tonight, we gently explore the heart and mind of Taejo Wang Geon, while history remembers him as the great unifier. Tonight you will discover the ambitious young warrior, whose dreams would reshape a divided peninsula. Close your eyes, and let his whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep, in the year 877. As the once mighty kingdom of Silla crumbled beneath the weight of its own contradictions, a child was born in the mountain-fortress town of Songgak, who would one day reunite the Korean peninsula under a single crown. The world into which Wang Geon emerged was one of chaos and opportunity, where the old order lay in ruins and ambitious men carved out new destinies with sword and cunning. The collapse of unified Silla had not happened overnight, but represented the culmination of decades of internal decay and political dysfunction. The kingdom that had once stood triumphant over Goryeo and Baekje, that had created the first unified Korean state in history, had fallen victim to the very success that had made it great. Power struggles among the royal family and aristocratic clans had paralyzed the central government, while crushing taxation and forced labor had driven the common people to the edge of desperation. Across the peninsula, local strongmen emerged to fill the vacuum left by royal authorities' retreat from effective governance. These regional warlords, known as Hojak, built their own armies, collected their own taxes, and governed their territories as independent kingdoms in all but name. The central government in Jeonju retained nominal authority, but its actual power extended little beyond the immediate vicinity of the ancient capital. Among these rising powers, none would prove more consequential than the family into which Wang Geon was born. His father, Yang Geon, later known as Wang Ryung, had transformed himself from successful merchant into military commander, building a formidable power base in the strategic regions surrounding Songgak. This was no mere bandit chief seizing temporary advantage, but a visionary leader who understood that the old world was dying and that those who would inherit the new must be prepared to think on a scale that transcended local concerns. The location of Songgak itself reflected the sophisticated strategic thinking that characterized the family's approach to power. Positioned at the crossroads of major trade routes connecting the northern and southern regions of the peninsula, it commanded access to both land and sea communications that would prove crucial in the coming struggles. Control of this territory meant control over the economic lifelines that sustained political power throughout the region. Wang Geon's childhood was shaped by his father's understanding that the future belonged to those who could combine military strength with political sophistication. Unlike many warlords who focused exclusively on immediate tactical advantages, Wang Ryung invested heavily in his son's education, ensuring that the boy learned not just the arts of war, but the complexities of governance, diplomacy, and strategic thinking that would be essential for anyone seeking to achieve lasting power. The young Wang Geon thus grew up in an environment that was simultaneously militarized and cultured, where discussions of battlefield tactics alternated with lessons in classical literature, where planning for the next campaign coexisted with long-term thinking about the kind of state that might eventually emerge from the current chaos. He learned to see beyond the immediate horizon of conquest to envision the institutional frameworks that could transform military victory into stable governance. His education was practical as well as theoretical. By his teenage years, he was accompanying his father on diplomatic missions and military expeditions, observing firsthand how successful leaders managed the complex relationships between warfare and politics, between local autonomy and central authority, between personal ambition and collective benefit. These experiences provided him with insights that would prove invaluable during his own rise to power. The decisive moment in young Wang Geon's early career came in 896, when the growing power of Gungye forced Songgak to make a crucial strategic choice. Gungye had emerged as one of the most formidable warlords in the region, carving out a substantial territory in what is now Gangwon province, and demanding submission from neighboring strongholds. The alternatives facing Wang Geon's family were stark: resist and risk destruction, or submit and hope to maintain some degree of autonomy within Gungye's expanding confederation. Wang Ryung's decision to ally with Gungye demonstrated the kind of strategic wisdom that had made his family powerful. Rather than viewing submission as humiliation, he recognized it as an opportunity to gain access to resources and authority that could never be achieved through isolated resistance. His proposal to Gungye was characteristically bold and far-sighted. If the warlord truly intended to become king of all Korea, he should establish his capital at Songgak and appoint Wang Geon as its governor. The audacity of this suggestion revealed the family's understanding that they possessed assets that Gungye needed more than he initially realized. Songgak's strategic location, its economic resources, and the administrative expertise that Wang Ryung's family had developed made them valuable partners rather than mere subjects. The proposal offered Gungye a ready-made capital infrastructure, while providing the Wang family with a central role in whatever state structure might eventually emerge. Gungye's acceptance of this arrangement marked the beginning of Wang Geon's meteoric rise within the emerging power structure. At the age of 20, he found himself appointed as Castellan of Baleo-Kamseong, a newly constructed fortress that served as the administrative center for Gungye's expanding territory. This position placed him at the intersection of military and civilian authority, providing him with experience in both warfare and governance that would prove essential to his future success. The partnership between Gungye and the Wang family initially benefited both parties enormously. Gungye gained access to Songgak's strategic advantages and the administrative expertise that enabled him to govern conquered territories effectively. Wang Geon acquired the military resources and political authority necessary to demonstrate his capabilities on a scale that would have been impossible for an isolated regional power. Under Gungye's patronage, Wang Geon began the series of military campaigns that would establish his reputation as one of the peninsula's most capable commanders. His first major independent command came in 900, when Gungye entrusted him with an ambitious expedition to capture territories in what are now Gyeonggi and northern Chungcheong provinces. The success of this campaign, which resulted in the capture of multiple fortified cities, including Gwangju, Cheongju, and Chengju, demonstrated both his tactical brilliance and his ability to inspire loyalty among his troops. But it was his naval expedition to Gumseong County in 903 that truly revealed the scope of his strategic vision. This operation, launched deep into later Baekje territory via sea routes, represented one of the most daring military ventures of the era. The target was not just any provincial stronghold, but Nayu, a crucial commercial and administrative center that controlled access to the southwestern coastal regions. The success of this expedition had implications that extended far beyond its immediate military objectives. By establishing a Gungye stronghold in the heart of later Baekje territory, Wang Geon had created a strategic dilemma for Jeonhwan that would influence the balance of power for years to come. The operation also demonstrated Wang Geon's understanding of the maritime dimensions of Korean warfare, insights that would prove crucial during the final campaigns of unification. Perhaps even more significantly, the expedition provided Wang Geon with his first substantial opportunity to implement the marriage diplomacy that would become one of his most effective political tools. His union with the daughter of a local warlord named Darien not only secured crucial local support for the new garrison, but also established the pattern of strategic marriages that would eventually connect his family to power centers throughout the peninsula. His marriage to Ladeo, who would later become Queen Jianghua and mother of Wang Geon's successor, reflected his sophisticated understanding of how personal relationships could be transformed into political alliances. Unlike many warlords who relied primarily on force and intimidation, Wang Geon demonstrated an early appreciation for the ways that kinship networks could create bonds of mutual interest that transcended immediate military considerations. His success in these early campaigns earned him rapid promotion within Gungye's hierarchy, advancing to the position of Pujintian, and eventually Sejong, the equivalent of Prime Minister. These appointments reflected not just royal favor, but recognition that Wang Geon possessed the rare combination of military genius and administrative capability that effective governance required. The records from this period suggest that Gungye was genuinely impressed by his young subordinate's achievements, reportedly telling his courtiers that none of his other generals could match Wang Geon's capabilities. Such praise from a leader known for his suspicion and paranoia indicated that Wang Geon had succeeded in demonstrating his value, while avoiding the appearance of disloyalty that might have triggered destructive jealousy. Yet even as Wang Geon consolidated his position within Gungye's regime, careful observers might have detected signs of the independent thinking that would eventually lead to their separation. His approach to conquered territories emphasized integration and reconciliation rather than exploitation and intimidation. His treatment of local elites focused on creating voluntary cooperation rather than enforced submission. His military strategies prioritized long-term stability over short-term advantage. These differences in approach might have remained manageable indefinitely if Gungye's own character had remained stable. But power, particularly the kind of absolute authority that Gungye was accumulating, has a way of revealing and amplifying personality flaws that might otherwise remain dormant. The warlord who had once shown reasonable judgment and strategic wisdom was gradually transforming into something far more dangerous and unpredictable. As the 910s progressed, Gungye's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. The pragmatic leader who had built a successful confederation through careful diplomacy and strategic alliances was being replaced by a paranoid tyrant who saw enemies everywhere and responded to imagined threats with genuine brutality. The very success that had elevated him to royal pretensions was undermining the practical wisdom that had made that success possible. Wang Geon, now in his late 30s and possessing his own substantial network of personal loyalties, found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His own success had made him wealthy and powerful enough to be perceived as a potential threat, while his moral convictions made it increasingly difficult to participate in or enable the atrocities that Gungye's rule was beginning to generate. The son of Songaku had once seen alliance with Gungye as the pathway to greater achievement was beginning to understand that their partnership had served its purpose and that the next phase of his career would require the young merchant's son was preparing to become a king. As shadows deepen and ancient ambitions steer, we return to the story of Wang Geon. Tonight, we witness the moment when loyalty becomes impossible, and revolution becomes inevitable. While kingdoms crumble and new dynasties rise, you will feel the weight of choices that transform subjects into sovereigns. By the year 914, the man who would become Taejo Wang Geon had reached the pinnacle of success within Gungye's rapidly expanding kingdom. His string of military victories had elevated him to the position of Sejong, effectively making him the second most powerful individual in a state that now controlled much of Central Korea. Yet this very success was creating the conditions for a crisis that would ultimately destroy the regime he had helped build. Gungye's transformation from pragmatic warlord into megalomaniacal tyrant had been gradual but inexorable. The man who had once demonstrated shrewd political judgment was increasingly consumed by grandiose delusions about his own divine nature and cosmic significance. He began claiming supernatural powers, demanding that his subjects worship him as a living Buddha, and responding to any perceived slight with savage brutality that shocked even veterans of Korea's violent political landscape. The psychological dynamics driving this transformation were complex but tragically predictable. Gungye had achieved power by demonstrating superior capability in a world where strength was the ultimate arbiter of authority. But once that authority was established, the very traits that had enabled his rise became obstacles to effective governance. The suspicion that had protected him from enemies now poisoned his relationships with allies. The ruthlessness that had intimidated opponents now terrorized the supporters whose loyalty he desperately needed. Wang Geon found himself in an increasingly impossible position as Gungye's paranoia focused with particular intensity on those closest to the throne. The king's trust, never easily given, was now extended to no one for any significant period. Court officials lived in constant fear that some innocent remark or routine action might be interpreted as evidence of disloyalty, triggering the kind of violent retribution that had already claimed numerous victims. The breaking point came with a series of incidents that revealed the complete breakdown of rational governance within Gungye's court. Ministers were executed on the basis of dreams and omens. Military commanders who reported unfavorable intelligence were punished as if they had created the problems they described. The administrative apparatus that had enabled the kingdom's expansion was being systematically destroyed by a ruler who could no longer distinguish between loyalty and opposition, between honest counsel and treasonous conspiracy. For Wang Geon, the situation was particularly acute, because his own success made him an inevitable target for Gungye's suspicions. The very military victories that had elevated him to his current position also made him a potential rival whose continued existence posed a theoretical threat to royal authority. In a court where paranoia had replaced rational calculation, theoretical threats were increasingly treated as immediate dangers requiring preemptive action. The historical records from this period, though necessarily filtered through the perspective of later Goryeo chroniclers, suggest that Wang Geon initially attempted to navigate these treacherous waters through careful political maneuvering, rather than direct confrontation. He reportedly counseled subordinates to maintain absolute loyalty while privately expressing concerns about the direction of royal policy. His public statements emphasized duty and service while carefully avoiding any language that might be construed as criticism or ambition. His delicate balancing act reflected both his political sophistication and his genuine reluctance to abandon the partnership that had enabled his rise to prominence. Wang Geon understood that overthrowing Gungye would necessarily involve enormous risks and uncertain outcomes. Even if such an enterprise succeeded, it would require him to assume responsibilities for governing a fractured kingdom in the midst of ongoing warfare with powerful enemies. The prospect of royal authority, however appealing in theory, carried with it burdens that no rational person would embrace lightly. But the luxury of maintaining neutrality was gradually being stripped away by the inexorable logic of Gungye's deteriorating mental state. The king's demand for absolute submission extended beyond mere political loyalty to encompass complete intellectual and moral subordination. Officials were expected not just to obey orders but to enthusiastically endorse policies they knew to be destructive and participate in ceremonies they recognized as fundamentally corrupt. The crisis deepened when Gungye's paranoid behavior began to threaten the military effectiveness that had provided the foundation for his kingdom's existence. Competent generals were being replaced by sycophants whose primary qualification was their willingness to flatter royal delusions. Strategic planning was being subordinated to astrological considerations and supernatural revelations. The professional military apparatus that Wang Geon had helped create was being transformed into an instrument of domestic repression rather than external defense, perhaps most dangerously from Wang Geon's perspective. Gungye's behavior was beginning to undermine the loyalty of regional strongmen whose voluntary cooperation was essential to the kingdom's survival. These local leaders had accepted Gungye's authority primarily because it served their own interests, providing them with military protection and political legitimacy in exchange for tax revenue and military service. But as stories of royal atrocities spread throughout the kingdom, these pragmatic alliances were being strained to the breaking point. Wang Geon's own network of personal loyalties, carefully cultivated through years of successful leadership and fair treatment, was becoming a source of both strength and vulnerability. The subordinates who admired his military genius and trusted his judgment were increasingly looking to him for guidance about how to respond to the moral crisis engulfing the court. Their expectations created pressure for decisive action, while simultaneously making him a more obvious target for royal suspicion. The conspiracy that eventually overthrew Gungye emerged gradually from this atmosphere of fear and moral revulsion, rather than being planned as a coherent enterprise from the beginning. The key figures who would eventually support Wang Geon's coup initially came together not as conspirators but as individuals seeking to protect themselves and their subordinates from an increasingly unpredictable and dangerous ruler. Hongyu, Beihyunjiang, Shin Sungyum, and Bakjigyum represented different constituencies within Gungye's regime. But they shared common concerns about the direction of royal policy and their own survival prospects under continued royal rule. These were not peripheral figures driven by personal grievances, but central members of the governmental apparatus whose support was essential for any alternative leadership arrangement. The gradual coalescing of opposition around Wang Geon reflected both his personal reputation and the practical necessity of identifying a credible alternate. Any successful coup would require not just the removal of the existing king, but the installation of a replacement capable of maintaining governmental continuity and military effectiveness. Wang Geon's combination of proven administrative capability and military reputation made him the obvious choice for anyone seeking to preserve the kingdom while changing its leadership. The moment when private dissatisfaction transformed into active conspiracy cannot be precisely dated, but it probably occurred sometime in early 918 when Gungye's behavior reached levels that made continued passive acceptance impossible for anyone with residual moral sensibilities. The specific trigger may have been a particularly savage execution, or perhaps simply the accumulated weight of numerous smaller atrocities that finally convinced the conspirators that their own survival depended on action. The planning for the coup reflected Wang Geon's characteristic attention to both strategic objectives and tactical détails, unlike many palace revolutions that focused primarily on eliminating the existing ruler. This conspiracy emphasized the need to maintain governmental continuity and popular legitimacy. The conspirators understood that their success would be measured not just by their ability to seize power but by their capacity to exercise it effectively in the face of enormous challenges. The actual execution of the coup in the 9th of June 18 was remarkably swift and decisive, suggesting that the conspirators had succeeded in neutralizing potential resistance before revealing their intentions. Gungye was removed from power and killed, though the exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. What is certain is that Wang Geon was immediately proclaimed king by the same group of officials who had orchestrated the previous ruler's downfall. The choice of Goryeo as the name for the new kingdom reflected both historical consciousness and political calculation. By invoking the ancient kingdom of Goryeo, Wang Geon was claiming legitimate succession to the greatest of Korea's northern kingdoms, while distinguishing his regime from the discredited legacy of Gungye's rule. The name suggested both continuity with the heroic past and innovation in governmental approach. The establishment of the Xian Suera name similarly emphasized themes of divine mandate and fresh beginnings that would be essential for legitimizing the new dynasty in the eyes of both domestic and foreign audiences. Wang Geon was claiming not just political authority, but cosmic approval for his assumption of royal power, positioning himself as the agent of heaven's will, rather than merely another successful usurper. The immediate aftermath of the coup revealed both the opportunities and challenges that would define Wang Geon's subsequent reign. The removal of Gungye eliminated the primary source of governmental dysfunction, but it also created a power vacuum that hostile neighbors would inevitably attempt to exploit. The new king inherited a kingdom with substantial military resources and territorial extent, but also one burdened by the political divisions and economic disruptions that Gungye's misrule had created. Most significantly, the coup had established a precedent that would influence all subsequent political calculations. Royal authority in this new kingdom would depend primarily on practical effectiveness, rather than hereditary legitimacy or divine right. Wang Geon had become king through military and political achievement, rather than birthright, creating expectations that his continued authority would be justified through comparable performance. The initial responses to news of the coup revealed the complex political landscape that the new king would need to navigate. Some regional strongmen welcomed the change, viewing Wang Geon's reputation for competent leadership as preferable to Gungye's increasingly erratic behavior. Others adopted a wait-and-see attitude, prepared to support the new regime if it demonstrated stability and effectiveness, but unwilling to commit themselves prematurely to what might prove to be another failed experiment. Most ominously, Jian Huan's later Baekje regime quickly recognized that Wang Geon's coup represented both an opportunity and a threat. The elimination of Gungye removed their most formidable northern rival, but it also installed in his place a leader whose military capabilities and political sophistication might prove even more dangerous in the long term. The initial diplomatic exchanges between the two kingdoms suggested mutual recognition, but also careful preparation for eventual conflict. As summer turned to autumn in 918, Wang Geon faced the enormous challenge of transforming military success into stable governance, while simultaneously preparing for the external conflicts that his assumption of power had made inevitable. The young merchant's son, who had once served others' ambitions, was now responsible for directing the destiny of a kingdom whose survival would depend entirely on his wisdom and capability. The fall of Gungye had created the opportunity for greatness, but realizing that opportunity would require all the skill and determination that the new king of Goryeo could summon. The real test of his worthiness to rule was about to begin. As war drums echo across a divided peninsula, we witness Wang Geon's greatest trials. Tonight, we stand beside the young king as he faces enemies who would crush his dreams of unity beneath the weight of superior armies. While kingdoms clash and heroes fall, you will feel the price of ambition measured in blood and iron. The honeymoon period following Wang Geon's assumption of power proved to be devastatingly brief. Within mere weeks of establishing the Goryeo Dynasty, the new king discovered that removing Gungye had solved only the most immediate of his problems, while creating entirely new challenges that would test every aspect of his leadership capabilities. The Korean peninsula in 918 was not ready for peace, and those who sought to rule it would have to prove their worthiness through trial by combat. The first ominous sign came in August, just 2 months after the coup, when more than 10 regions that had previously acknowledged Goryeo's authority suddenly defected to later Baekje. These included strategically important territories like Gungju and Unju, whose loss significantly weakened Goryeo's defensive positions, while strengthening Jian Huan's ability to threaten the new kingdom's heartland. The defections revealed the fragility of political loyalties in an era when survival often depended on choosing the winning side before the outcome became clear. Wang Geon's response to this crisis demonstrated both his political sophistication and his understanding that royal authority could not be maintained through military force alone. Rather than immediately dispatching armies to reclaim the lost territories, he focused first on consolidating his position among those supporters who remained loyal while carefully analyzing the motivations driving the defections. His approach emphasized persuasion and incentive rather than punishment and intimidation. His measured response reflected his awareness that hasty action could easily transform a manageable political setback into a catastrophic military disaster. The regions that had defected possessed significant defensive capabilities and local knowledge that would make any attempt at forcible reconquest both costly and uncertain. More importantly, visible failure in such an enterprise would likely trigger additional defections that could spiral beyond any possibility of control. The underlying challenge Wang Geon faced was that his legitimacy remained fundamentally contested. Unlike hereditary monarchs who could claim authority through bloodline or foreign conquerors who could impose their will through overwhelming force, he had to convince skeptical audiences that his rule served their interests better than available alternatives. This requirement made every political and military decision a test of his overall fitness to govern. The tension escalated dramatically in the 9th of October 20. When the simmering rivalry between Goryeo and later Baekje exploded into open warfare. The immediate cause was a dispute over Silla's allegiance, with Jian Huan launching a direct attack on the ancient kingdom, while Wang Geon responded to Silla's desperate plea for assistance. But the deeper issue was the fundamental incompatibility between two ambitious rulers, who each envisioned themselves as the rightful heir to Korean unification. Jian Huan's strategic position appeared overwhelmingly superior to any objective observer. His kingdom controlled the fertile southwestern regions of the peninsula, providing him with abundant agricultural resources and commercial revenues. His military forces were veteran troops hardened by decades of continuous warfare. His diplomatic position was strengthened by the voluntary allegiance of numerous local strongmen, who viewed later Bakshi as the most likely ultimate victor in the struggle for peninsular dominance. Wang Geon, by contrast, commanded a kingdom that had been founded through political conspiracy, rather than military conquest, governed territories of uncertain loyalty, and faced the enormous challenge of maintaining internal unity, while simultaneously prosecuting external warfare. His advantages lay primarily in his personal capabilities as a commander and administrator, rather than in any inherent structural superiority of his position. The early phases of the conflict seemed to confirm the pessimistic assessments of Goryeo's prospects. Despite some initial successes in border skirmishes, Wang Geon found himself increasingly pressed by later Baekje forces that appeared to possess superior numbers, better equipment, and more experienced leadership. The new king's army, while competent, lacked the cohesion and veteran status that characterized Jian Huan's professional military machine. More troubling from a strategic perspective was Jian Huan's demonstrated ability to coordinate military pressure with political warfare in ways that threatened to unravel Goryeo's territorial integrity. Later Baekje's agents actively promoted defections among Goryeo's regional allies, while spreading propaganda about Wang Geon's illegitimate seizure of power and inevitable defeat. These efforts created a climate of uncertainty that made fence-sitting appear more attractive than loyal resistance. The psychological pressure on Wang Geon during this period must have been enormous. He had staked everything on his ability to create a stable alternative to the chaos that had characterized Korean politics for generations. But the early results suggested that his ambitions might have exceeded his capabilities. The young king, who had once seemed destined for greatness, was beginning to appear like another failed usurper, whose brief moment of prominence would end in exile or death. The crisis reached its climax in the 9th of October 27, when Jian Huan achieved what appeared to be a decisive strategic breakthrough. His forces captured Silla's capital of Jeonju in a lightning campaign that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and ruthless determination. King Gyeonggi was forced to commit suicide, the ancient city was systematically looted, and a puppet ruler named Gyeongsun was installed to legitimize later Baekje's effective control over the peninsula's oldest kingdom. The fall of Jeonju sent shockwaves throughout the region that extended far beyond its immediate military significance. Silla had been the symbol of Korean unity and cultural achievement for nearly 3 centuries, and its subjugation represented a psychological victory for Jian Huan that threatened to undermine resistance throughout the peninsula. Local strongmen who had been waiting to see which kingdom would prove strongest now had compelling evidence that later Baekje possessed the momentum that typically preceded ultimate victory. Wang Geon's decision to personally lead a relief expedition toward Jeonju reflected both his military instincts and his understanding that passive respond. With 5,000 elite cavalry, he marched south in a desperate attempt to restore the balance of power and demonstrate that Goryeo remained a viable alternative to later Baekje domination. The battle that followed at Gongsun, near what is now Daegu, became one of the most significant military encounters in Korean history. The engagement pitted Wang Geon's smaller but highly motivated force against Jian Huan's larger and more experienced army, in a contest that would determine not just immediate tactical advantage, but the long-term viability of both kingdoms' unification ambitions. The combat was ferocious and decisive, but not in the way that Wang Geon had hoped. His forces fought with desperate courage, but were systematically overwhelmed by later Bichi troops, who demonstrated superior coordination and tactical flexibility. The defeat was not merely a military setback, but a near catastrophe that claimed the lives of some of Goryeo's most capable commanders, including Kim Rak and Shin Sung-yum, whose loss would be felt for years to come. Wang Geon himself barely escaped with his life, saved only by the heroic sacrifice of his bodyguards, and a degree of luck that suggested either divine protection or remarkable personal resilience. The experience of fleeing in defeat from a battlefield where his closest supporters had died defending his ambitions must have been profoundly traumatic for someone whose entire career had been built on military success and personal invincibility. The aftermath of Gongsan marked the lowest point in Wang Geon's career and the closest he would ever come to a Lu Jianhuan's forces pressed their advantage mercilessly, capturing additional territories and threatening to complete the destruction of Goryeo as an independent political entity. Later Bichi's diplomatic correspondence from this period, preserved in Goryeo records, reveals the confidence of approaching total victory. One message, in particular, demonstrated the psychological impact that Jianhuan sought to achieve through his military successes. What I desire is to hang my bow in the pavilions of Pyongyang, and water my horses at the banks of the Dedong River. This was not merely military boasting, but a calculated attempt to demoralize Goryeo's remaining supporters, by painting a vivid picture of their kingdom's inevitable conquest, and their capital's occupation. For nearly 2 years, Wang Geon found himself in the unfamiliar position of fighting for survival, rather than expansion. His strategies during this period emphasized defensive warfare and gradual recovery rather than the bold offensive operations that had characterized his earlier career. The young king who had once seemed destined to reshape the peninsula was now struggling simply to preserve the kingdom he had created. Yet this period of adversity also revealed qualities of leadership that might never have emerged under more favorable circumstances. Wang Geon's response to near defeat demonstrated remarkable psychological resilience and strategic flexibility, rather than allowing despair to paralyze his decision-making or attempting to recoup losses through reckless gambling. He methodically rebuilt his military capabilities while carefully analyzing the sources of his previous failures. His approach during these dark months emphasized the cultivation of local alliances and the patient accumulation of small advantages rather than the pursuit of dramatic victories that might prove ephemeral. He understood that ultimate success would require not just military victory, but the creation of sustainable political relationships that could survive the inevitable ups and downs of continued warfare. The turning point, when it finally came in the 9th of December 29, arose from exactly the kind of patient alliance building that Wang Geon had been pursuing throughout his period of weakness. The siege of Gachun County, in what is now Andong, provided him with an opportunity to demonstrate renewed military effectiveness, while simultaneously winning the support of local strongmen who had been waiting to see evidence of Goryeo's recovery. The success of Yukum Hill's breakthrough attack that shattered the siege represented more than just tactical victory. It marked the beginning of a psychological shift that would ultimately prove more important than any single battle. Local leaders like Kim Seon-pyong, Guan Heng, and Jang Gil, who had been maintaining careful neutrality, suddenly found reasons to support Goryeo's cause, as it became apparent that Wang Geon's earlier defeats had not destroyed his capacity for effective leadership. The cascade of surrenders that followed, 30 counties in Yangon alone, followed by over 100 fortified positions throughout Gangwon and Gyeongsang provinces, demonstrated how rapidly momentum could shift in Korean warfare once psychological tipping points were reached. Wang Geon's patient cultivation of local relationships was finally bearing fruit as regional strongmen decided that Goryeo's prospects had improved sufficiently to justify active support. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this recovery was the way it revealed Wang Geon's evolution as a strategic thinker. The young commander, who had once relied primarily on personal charisma and tactical brilliance, was maturing into a sophisticated political leader who understood that lasting victory required the construction of broad coalitions rather than mere military dominance. As 930 dawned, the balance of power on the Korean peninsula was shifting in ways that few could have predicted just months earlier. The kingdom that had seemed destined for destruction was demonstrating remarkable resilience, while its enemies were beginning to discover that initial advantages could prove surprisingly fragile when confronted with determined and intelligent opposition. The blood and iron that had tested Wang Geon's worthiness to rule were forging him into the kind of leader who might actually prove capable of achieving the unified Korea that had eluded so many people. The real test would come in the campaigns ahead, as destiny calls across the morning mist. We witness the final triumph of Wang Geon's extraordinary vision. Tonight, we stand beside the great unifier, as he transforms a dream of unity into the reality that would endure 4 or 5 centuries. While the last barriers fall and a new age dawns, you will feel the birth of a kingdom that would define Korea forever. The decade of the 930s opened with Wang Geon positioned as he had never been before. Not merely as a survivor of catastrophic defeat, but as a leader whose resilience had been tested in the crucible of near destruction, and proven stronger than his enemies had believed possible. The momentum that had begun with the relief of Gangye County was accelerating into something that resembled the inevitability of historical destiny. Yet even as military fortune shifted in Goryeo's favor, Wang Geon understood that ultimate victory would require more than battlefield success. The Korean peninsula had been trapped in cycles of warfare and division for generations precisely because military conquest had never been successfully transformed into stable political unity. His challenge was not merely to defeat his enemies, but to create institutional foundations that could prevent future fragmentation. The systematic approach he developed during this period reflected lessons learned from both his own earlier failures and the broader patterns of Korean political history. Rather than attempting to impose unity through pure force, he focused on creating voluntary associations of interest that would make cooperation more attractive than resistance. His strategy emphasized integration rather than domination, reconciliation rather than revenge. This philosophy was put to its greatest test when later Gungye began to collapse from internal contradictions that Wang Geon had done nothing to create, but everything to encourage. The crisis began in the mid-930s, when Jian Huan's own family structure, strained by the pressures of prolonged warfare and succession planning, erupted into the kind of violent power struggle that had destroyed so many Korean kingdoms throughout history. The specific trigger was Jian Huan's decision to designate his fourth son, Gungye, as heir apparent rather than his eldest son, Sinjiam. This choice, whether motivated by genuine assessment of capability or personal favoritism, created exactly the kind of succession dispute that ambitious warlords were least equipped to manage peacefully. Sinjiam's response was swift and brutal. He imprisoned his father and assumed royal authority through what amounted to a palace coup. For Wang Geon, this development represented an almost perfect strategic opportunity. The kingdom that had been his most formidable enemy was now divided against itself, with legitimate claims to royal authority being contested through methods that undermined any pretense to stable governance. More importantly, Jian Huan's imprisonment provided a potential source of legitimacy for Goryeo intervention that could transform naked aggression into justified liberation. Jian Huan's escape from captivity and subsequent flight to Goryeo in 935 created exactly the scenario that Wang Geon's strategic planning had been designed to exploit. The former enemy who arrived at his court was not just a valuable source of intelligence about later Gungye's military capabilities and political vulnerabilities, but a living symbol of legitimacy that could justify the coming invasion as restoration rather than conquest. The diplomatic maneuvering that followed demonstrated Wang Geon's sophisticated understanding of how symbolic politics could shape practical military outcomes. by treating Geon H1 as an honored guest rather than a defeated enemy. He gained access to the older king's extensive knowledge, while simultaneously positioning himself as the defender of legitimate authority against usurpation and patricide. When Geon Huan formally requested Goryeo military assistance to restore him to his rightful throne and punish his rebellious son, Wang Geon possessed the perfect justification for the final campaign that would complete Korean unification. The expedition that launched in 936 could be presented to both domestic and international audiences as an intervention on behalf of justice rather than an act of aggressive expansion. The military campaign that followed was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. Wang Geon's forces, now commanded by his son Wang Mu, and supported by his own strategic direction, encountered remarkably little effective resistance from later Baekje armies that were demoralized by internal conflict, and uncertain about the legitimacy of their cause. The siege tactics and political warfare that Goryeo had perfected during years of defensive struggle proved devastatingly effective when applied to offensive operations. The Battle of Elysian in the 9th of September 36 marked the effective end of later Baekje as an independent kingdom. The defeat and capture of Sinjiam eliminated the last credible claimant to royal authority within the former enemy kingdom, while the systematic occupation of major cities and fortresses demonstrated that Goryeo now possessed the administrative capabilities necessary to govern conquered territories effectively. But perhaps more significant than the military victory was the manner in which Wang Geon managed the political integration of later Baekje's former territory. Rather than treating conquered populations as subjects to be exploited, he implemented policies designed to transform former enemies into willing partners in the unified Korean state. His approach emphasized continuity of local governance structures, while gradually integrating them into Goryeo's broader institutional framework. The success of this integration strategy was demonstrated most clearly by the ease with which Silla's final surrender was negotiated in 935. King Gyeongsun's decision to abdicate voluntarily in favor of Wang Geon reflected not just military realism, but genuine confidence that Goryeo rule would prove preferable to the chaos and uncertainty that had characterized the later Three Kingdoms period. The ceremony marking Silla's formal submission was carefully choreographed to Amridia. Wang Geon's treatment of the former Silla royal family was generous to the point of magnanimity, with King Gyeongsun receiving substantial territorial grants and honorary positions that maintained his dignity while acknowledging Goryeo's paramount authority. His diplomatic success eliminated the last independent Korean kingdom without the bloodshed and destruction that typically accompanied such transitions. More importantly, it established precedents for peaceful political integration that would influence Korean governmental practices for centuries. Wang Geon had demonstrated that unification could be achieved through attraction rather than coercion. With the completion of political unification in 936, Wang Geon faced the even more challenging task of creating administrative and cultural frameworks that could transform military victory into stable governance. The peninsula he now ruled contained populations with different dialects, customs, and historical experiences that had been shaped by generations of political division and military conflict. His approach to these challenges reflected the same strategic thinking that had characterized his military campaigns. Rather than attempting to impose uniform standards immediately, he focused on creating incentive structures that would gradually encourage voluntary adoption of common practices. His policies emphasized economic development, educational opportunity, and religious freedom as mechanisms for building popular support for unified government. The famous 10 injunctions that he compiled near the end of his life distilled decades of practical experience into strategic guidance for future rulers. These instructions emphasized the importance of maintaining religious tolerance, respecting regional differences, choosing capable administrators regardless of their origins, and avoiding the kind of favoritism and corruption that had destroyed previous Korean kingdoms. Perhaps most significantly, The 10 injunctions revealed Wang Geon's understanding that successful governance required constant vigilance against the psychological corruptions that power inevitably created. His warnings about the dangers of luxury, the importance of listening to criticism, and the need to maintain personal connections with ordinary citizens reflected hard-won wisdom about the challenges facing any dynasty that sought to endure beyond its founder's lifetime. The institutional innovations he implemented during his final years were designed to address specific problems that had destroyed previous attempts at Korea. His land distribution system rewarded loyal service, while preventing the concentration of wealth that typically led to aristocratic rebellion. His military organization balanced central authority with regional autonomy in ways that maintained effective defense while minimizing the risk of successful coups. Most importantly, his educational and cultural policies actively promoted the development of shared Korean identity that could transcend the regional loyalties that had previously prevented political unity. By encouraging intermarriage between formerly hostile populations, supporting scholarly exchanges, and patronizing cultural institutions that celebrated common Korean heritage, he laid the groundwork for the kind of national consciousness that could sustain unified government. Wang Geon's death in 943, at the age of 66, marked the end of one of the most remarkable careers in Korean history. The merchant's son, who had begun his adult life as a subordinate to a provincial warlord, had not only unified the Korean peninsula but created governmental institutions that would endure for nearly 5 centuries. His transformation from ambitious young warrior into visionary statesman represented one of history's most successful examples of personal growth matching historical opportunity. The stability of the succession to his son Wang Mu, who became King Haejong, demonstrated that Wang Geon had succeeded in creating institutional frameworks that could function effectively even without his personal leadership. The smooth transition of power reflected the success of his efforts to build broad-based support for unified Korean government among all social classes and regional populations. The legacy he left extended far beyond the immediate political unification he had achieved. His integration of Korean governmental traditions with innovative administrative practices created a template for effective governance that would influence East Asian political development for centuries. His demonstration that military victory could be transformed into lasting peace through wise policies and inclusive leadership provided inspiration for future leaders facing similar challenges. Perhaps most significantly, Wang Geon had proven that Korean political unity was not only possible but sustainable, when based on respect for regional differences and popular consent, rather than mere military force. The Goryeo Dynasty he founded would face numerous external threats and internal challenges over the following centuries. But the institutional foundations he created would prove strong enough to preserve Korean independence and cultural identity through all subsequent trials. The young man who had once stood before Gungye as a provincial subordinate had fulfilled a destiny that surpassed even the most optimistic predictions of his early supporters. Through courage, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to Korean unity, he had transformed himself from ambitious warlord into the father of a nation that would endure until the modern era. As we close this chapter of Whispered Memories, remember that true greatness lies not in conquest alone, but in the vision to transform victory into lasting peace. Wang Geon's legacy reminds us that the highest achievements of leadership come not from destroying enemies, but from creating institutions that enable former enemies to become partners in building something greater than any individual ambition. Close your eyes and let these whispered memories carry you to peaceful sleep, knowing that some dreams are powerful enough to reshape the world, and some leaders possess the wisdom to make those dreams endure for centuries.